Hey peeps, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today I've got for you a crash course in philosophy of religion. It's not going to be a survey of the whole field of philosophy of religion, or even a survey of absolutely every question that philosophers of religion ask, but we are going to be covering quite a lot of topics in the philosophy of religion. We're going to be asking what is religion, what is philosophy of religion, what are some of the best arguments for and against God's existence, what are some deficiencies in contemporary philosophy of religion, and how should we work to change them? What about religious experience, right? What should we think about that? What about different models of God and ultimate reality? And finally, what's the relationship between God and morality? We're going to be covering all these questions and more, so buckle up for a fun and hopefully illuminating discussion. Now, note that this discussion originally took place on the channel called LS Philosophy. Many thanks to them for having me on. I quite enjoyed it, and I thought that you all would enjoy it and benefit from it as well. The original video can be found on LS Philosophy's channel, of course, but also in my YouTube Appearances playlist. But without further ado, let's get into the video.
Hello everybody, it's Tamara Pianpot here, and today we're going to have a discussion about philosophy of religion with Joe from Majesty of Reason. First, I would like you to introduce yourself and introduce your project, whatever you'd like to share with public about yourself.
All right. Yeah, thank you for having me on. I'm excited for this. So, as you said, my name is Joe, and I have a YouTube channel called Majesty of Reason, where I talk mostly about philosophy of religion, but also metaphysics, some epistemology, some philosophy of time, occasionally some metaethics. So I dip in lots of different places, but philosophy of religion is probably my favorite to talk about. And yeah, I do both popular and scholarly work. So on the scholarly level, I publish articles and books and things like that. And so people can check out either my website or my Phil People profile. I'm sure people can find that if they look it up. And so that's the scholarly level. And then on, the popular level, I've got my YouTube channel and a blog by the same name, but I mainly do stuff on the YouTube channel. So yeah, I have discussions with other philosophers, as well as making my own lecture-style videos. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
All right, thank you very much. And I would like to get straight to the topic. First, I'd like to ask some questions about the definitions of what we are going to talk about. So, what's religion in your opinion?
Well, isn't that a difficult question? Yeah, so there's a lot of scholarly debate about how to categorize religion, how to define religion, and it's extremely difficult to give a definition that captures the necessary and sufficient conditions, because you firstly want to encapsulate all the different religions that there are. You want to include them in your definition, but you also want to exclude things like political ideologies, things like communism, Nazism, and all these other sorts of things. You want to exclude those from your definition, but you want to include the whole panoply of things that we would, intuitively recognize as religions. So off the top of my head, I don't have any definition, any sure signs, but we can certainly rule out some things at the outset. Like, for instance, religions don't necessarily involve service to, dedication to, devotion to a god or gods. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case, because we have certain Eastern religions in which God plays no role, in which you could properly call them atheistic. And so God, for instance, we would want to rule that out as including stipulatively within your definition. And so, roughly, lots of the definitions are going to include something like rituals, right? Religions are going to have various ritualistic aspects to them. They're going to have various communal aspects to them. They're going to involve some sort of devotion to something of ultimate concern. So that thing of ultimate concern may or may not be personal, may or may not be a god. It might be something like a karmic cycle. And then that's also going to get into how it can provide certain guidance, religions that is, and their various tenets and doctrines. They can provide guidance on your moral and practical life. So it's this super duper complicated thing, but at least I hope I'm saying some things that can give people an idea of what it is. And there's a lot of debate, and I'm sure people can find certain really rigorous, precise, worked out definitions of it online.
Yeah, so we can certainly define some necessary conditions for defining religion, such as, religious practices. And does it necessarily have to do with some not superficial, but with something not material,
Like
should
supernatural, basically.
Yes, I forgot the word. I'm sorry. So does it have to be? Does the religious practices necessarily include practices surrounding some supernatural beings or substances?
Yeah, so as a necessary condition, I probably would not want to include that as a necessary condition, just because, certain Eastern religions, they might include something that I guess we might say is supernatural, like maybe the Tao or something like that, or maybe like a karmic cycle, but they might conceive of these things as perfectly natural aspects of the world around us, and they're not some sort of transcendent supernatural, something beyond like this material framework in which we find ourselves. So I wouldn't want to include that as a necessary condition, lest we rule out these various other traditions. And by itself, it's somewhat difficult actually to cash out the distinction between natural and supernatural. In the Middle Ages, I think, is when something like that distinction cropped up. And it was mainly to just try to demarcate God and angels and those sorts of things from the kind of material, like you said, the material created order that God creates and sustains and so on. So even that distinction, I mean, and it's come to have a different life of its own in contemporary philosophy. You know, some people will take the natural facts to just be what we can scientifically investigate, or there are lots of different ways that you can cash out the distinction. So I wouldn't really want to have that distinction within a definition of it, and I probably also wouldn't want to put it as a necessary condition, because again, certain religions might take like karmic structures or whatever is their ultimate concern or concerns, they might not take those as involving something supernatural.
Okay, so maybe we can define some methodological aspects of getting knowledge as the basis of defining religions and separating it from, for example, political ideologies.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's sort of, we're kind of using the tools that philosophers more generally use to come up with good definitions, right? So in this context, we're looking at, firstly, we want them to be extensionally adequate. So what that means is that we're capturing all and only those things which we want to capture, which we're interested in. So all and only the religions. Like you said, we're ruling out political ideologies and so on. So that's one criterion of having a good definition. A second criterion, we might say, is that it doesn't really, it's not an insider's definition. What do I mean by that? An insider's definition is something like, it's kind of like biased from the perspective of a particular religious group. So like some attempts to define religion are like really, you can see they're either like Eurocentric or they are like Christocentric, you know?
Yeah, we have like a question about it.
No, they like define other things in opposition to, let's say, Christianity or these other sorts of things. And if they don't sufficiently resemble it, then they don't count as religion, or they're false religion, or those sorts of things. So we also want to rule out, we don't want it to be prejudicial or biased in that sort of way. So we don't want it to be an insider definition. We want it to be extensionally adequate. Ideally, we want it to capture the necessary and sufficient conditions. And of course, how do you test these sorts of things? Well, I guess we just look at ordinary language, how we describe things as religion or not. We look at how the people within certain groups that we describe as religious, how they describe themselves, whether or not they take it to be something religious or something of ultimate concern, etc. And really, it's just the way that we test definitions more generally. We look for counterexamples, we see if it's sufficient, we see if it's necessary, we try not to have it be biased in certain ways, etc., etc., etc. So, and of course, ideally, you know, you'd want it to be relatively simple, not ad hoc, you know. We don't just want it to be a list of the religions that there are, because that's not illuminating, right? It's not giving us some unifying core. So in addition, we want it to be explanatory. We want it to give a kind of unifying core to the various religions that there are. So those are some different ways that philosophers and others in this area kind of try to build a definition.
Okay, so now we can say that it's just convention that defines whether something is a religion or not. Okay, well, the next question is rather simpler. So how do you define philosophy of religion? And does it fall into a metaphysical branch of philosophy, or should it be a separate field, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So part of the problem is that getting a grip on defining philosophy of religion is going to require us to get a grip on what philosophy is, and of course that's notoriously difficult to define. So I forget who precisely it was, but one of the major figures in kind of contemporary-ish, late 20th century philosophy said that philosophy is broadly concerned with the way that things, in the most general sense, hang together in the most general sense. So we're basically trying to see how things hang together, how the world works, how we come to have knowledge of that world, what the world is like in its most fundamental nature, and so on. So as I kind of see philosophy, it's a rigorous, systematic analysis and evaluation of the fundamental nature of reality, our epistemic access to that reality, and maybe how to live within that reality. So maybe that's a working definition that we can go with.
Well, maybe how to live is actually a question of ethics. But
yeah, and ethics it just depends on how you draw the categorizations, because ethics we could take as a subfield within philosophy, for instance. So yeah, it's all really just going to depend. And so that's philosophy. It's just this kind of systematic, rigorous analysis and evaluation of these various aspects of reality and our epistemic access to it and the various values that it might be imbued with. So how does that apply to religion? Well, then it's a systematic analysis and evaluation of the various tenets or doctrines or rituals, etc., associated with religion. So you're analyzing, does God exist? What are the arguments for and against God's existence? If God exists, what is he like? What would he or she or it, what would it be like? You're asking, is there an afterlife? Could there be an afterlife? If so, what is it like? And how do we have epistemic access to that? How should we live in light of the fact that there is religious disagreement around us? How should we treat that? How should we update our beliefs in light of that kind of religious disagreement? Is there something special about religious disagreement as opposed to scientific or ethical disagreement, etc.? So you're just asking these super fundamental questions about religions and the various things associated with religions, like things of ultimate concern, God, afterlife, etc. So that's kind of how I would see philosophy of religion. It's this rigorous, systematic analysis and evaluation using the tools, I would say, of analytic philosophy and probing the various tenets of religions. And I mean, the main thing that goes on, or at least the forefront, is about God, whether God exists and what God would be like. But of course, there's other stuff like religious disagreement, religious experience, how to, etc. So anyway.
yeah, I think that's a kind of a full definition. Not okay, sorry. So is it a separate field?
Oh, I forgot to answer that one. You're right.
Yeah,
Good.
yeah. No.
No, thank you for reminding me. Yeah. Is it separate
Yeah.
from like metaphysics or whatever? So as I kind of see it, what's really nice about philosophy of religion is that it touches on so many of these different areas. You've got metaphysics coming in because, well, metaphysics is concerned with the ultimate nature of reality, the fundamental nature of reality, and we're concerned with what there is out there. And so, of course, philosophy of religion falls under that. Is there an afterlife? Are we immaterial souls? I mean, that's, of course, having to do with philosophy of mind, but it also bridges into philosophy of religion because, religions say a lot about souls and things like that. So it does definitely fall squarely, some aspects of philosophy of religion fall squarely within metaphysics. And like, God's existence, that's kind of like a metaphysical question. It's about the fundamental nature of reality. But of course, there are other aspects of philosophy of religion that fall squarely within epistemology, right? How should we update our beliefs or our credences in light of profound religious disagreement? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you justify religious beliefs? Can you have religious beliefs justified in a kind of properly basic way? Just like how we don't need like a decisive proof for an external world, do we also not need a decisive proof to be licensed to believe in God? Like these sorts of questions are epistemological questions. So for me, philosophy of religion spans so many different fields that I wouldn't really feel comfortable placing it within metaphysics, let's say, or within epistemology. I would include it as a separate field in its own right, similar to how we could say philosophy of science is a separate field in its own right, as is philosophy of language, etc. So.
Okay, thank you. And what about philosophical theology? is it just a synonym of philosophy of religion, or is it a separate subfield inside the philosophy of religion? What's your opinion about it?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So, as I understand the usage of the terms, philosophical theology would use a lot of the tools of analytic philosophy, but it would take a lot more for granted than philosophy of religion does. So philosophical theology kind of works within a pre-given or pre-established framework, like Christianity or the broad core doctrines of Christianity, and then you try to apply the tools of analytic philosophy to try to work out, let's say, a consistent view of Trinitarianism, or a consistent view of the incarnation, or a consistent view of God's relation to time. In lots of these investigations, you're kind of taking for granted, let's say, some of the core Christian doctrines, or maybe the core claim that God exists, and then you're trying to work out, using the tools of philosophy, using the tools of analytic philosophy, to build up your kind of systematic theology, your view of God, God's nature, and his relation to the world. So it's similar to philosophy of religion, but again, it's working within this kind of pre-given framework. You're having a lot of these assumptions on board that in philosophy of religion, you're taking those assumptions on the table and you're analyzing those. No, we're not going to take for granted whether or not God exists. We're not going to take for granted whether or not Christianity is true. We're going to systematically probe that using the tools of analytic philosophy. So at least for me, more fundamental than philosophical theology is philosophy of religion, because that's investigating those very core assumptions that go in as a kind of bedrock of what you could call analytic theology or philosophical theology. So yeah.
Okay, so philosophical theology subjects a rather practical approaches to religion, and not theoretical necessarily. Well, that's kind of weird, because philosophy is almost all about theory. So I don't think whether I got this right or not. All right, and again, we've already talked a little about some biases in philosophy of religion. And don't you think that there is a bias towards Abrahamic religions? Like, usually philosophers don't question the basics, such as it's not really a matter of discussion whether God is omnipotent. It's usually about how the omnipotence works. And if you agree with it, what's the correlation with it? What are the how had it even became so?
Yeah. So that's a good question. I do think there is, I mean, at least in certain areas of philosophy of religion, there is significant bias. I mean, sometimes it can come to seem as philosophy of Christianity sometimes, or like philosophy of Abrahamic religions, or, those sorts of things. So if you just look at the preponderant, like I shouldn't say the preponderance, the proportion of work being done, it's definitely disproportionately focused on Western religions and the Abrahamic faith, and specifically working within that kind of traditional monotheistic conception of God. Now, thankfully, there are philosophers who are working to kind of challenge this. So Yuji Nagasawa, I think, he's one of the big names in philosophy of religion. He recently, I think, got one of the Templeton Prize or whatever. I think it's like $1 million or something. But it's really the project is to like globalize philosophy of religion, to bring in certain aspects of, let's say, African religions and Indian religions and indigenous religions and Eastern religions, and to really kind of bring these in to the analytic philosophy of religion to try to evaluate them, because they do have substantive content and they have interesting things to say about these traditional questions that we've been asking about the afterlife and about the nature of God and about whether God exists and so on. So there are positive steps being taken by Yuji Nagasawa, by others who are looking at non-Western and non-Abrahamic conceptions of God and religions. And so that, I think that's a really positive sign. But I mean, you are right that at least thus far, the vast proportion of it has been specifically Christianity and also, I guess, more broadly, Abrahamic faith. Now, how did this come to be? Well, that's an excellent question. I honestly don't quite know. I mean, I suspect that it's a selection effect. So I suspect that just the people who are more interested in religion are going to be people who are already quite religious. It's like, if someone is an atheist and and they're pretty diehard atheists, let's say, they don't even think that this is studying something in reality, they're less likely to go into it as a subject to study and so on, because they don't even think that it exists. So it's like those who are antecedently already inclined to religious belief are more likely to even go into the field. And of course, then they're just going to be writing on things that interest them with respect to their religious beliefs. So that can partially explain it. Another thing that explains it is perhaps language barriers and things like that. So, I mean, philosophy of religion, at least as I'm aware of it, is like largely dominated by the Anglosphere, right? Like Australia, Canada, United States, England, etc. And so you'd expect then that the predominant religious influences on these cultures would similarly be predominantly and disproportionately affecting what's discussed in philosophy of religion. So, of course, what is predominant in the Anglosphere? It's mainly Christianity. So you would expect to see that kind of bias creep in, which I think you do see. So I guess those are some of my hypotheses about what might explain it. But again, I'd like to emphasize that there are trajectories in the field that are looking brighter, and with they're trying to rectify this bias.
Yeah, and I think it also comes to the fact that philosophy and Western culture and Christianity are so binded together that, most philosophers are European or American, and that's why, like, a European man that grew up, or a woman who grew up in European culture, surrounded by those ideas, he or she just cannot really understand the Eastern religions and the Eastern culture, or African cultures too. And that's why it's so hard to even define those concepts and even say that it is that they are religious at all, because our mind is so it is so largely formed by those concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. That's similar to like the insider's definition, right? Like we're swimming within this kind of highly Christianly and we could say broadly Judeo-Christian, but like the Europeans and the Anglosphere is swimming within this kind of milieu, this cultural milieu, this political one, this ideological one, and that's definitely going to influence not only how they see other religions, and they might come up with certain insider definitions biased towards Christianity because of that, or whatever, biased toward Abrahamic religions, but also it's going to influence what their output is, what they write on, and so on, and that likewise accounts for bias. So yeah.
Yeah, all right. So, talking about your views, as I understand, you consider yourself an agnostic. And so,
Yes.
What stops you from becoming an atheist or a theist? And just whose arguments are more convincing? If you can answer that question, and if so, why didn't you choose those who are more convincing to you? Those whose arguments are more convincing to you?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So, of course, there are tricky definitional issues here. Here's how I'm going to understand the terms. So, a theist is someone who believes or affirms that God exists, or some gods exist. An atheist is one who believes or affirms that no gods exist. And an agnostic is someone who suspends judgment on the matter. They say they believe neither that God exists or that gods exist, nor do they believe that gods don't exist. So they suspend judgment on the matter. And of course, agnostics that can be broken up into different varieties. So you can ask, well, why do they suspend judgment? Do they suspend judgment because they think it's unknowable in principle whether or not there are gods? Or do they think, yeah, it might be knowable in principle, but just the evidence is roughly counterbalanced, or maybe it's ambiguous, or maybe it's indeterminate? So I don't fall into that camp where they say you cannot know in principle. Instead, my agnosticism is a suspension of judgment based on the fact that, at least by my lights, the evidence roughly counterbalances for the claim that God exists, where I just mean the kind of traditional monotheistic God on the one hand, and then we could say naturalism, where the natural reality exhausts causal reality. So there's only the spatio-temporal world around us, etc., at least in terms of concrete objects. So I'm kind of agnostic between those two views, and the reason is, like I said, I think the evidence roughly counterbalances. The weight of reasons by my lights roughly counterbalances. So something that pulls me towards, I'll just give, I guess, one or two reasons that pull me towards either direction. So one reason that pulls me towards atheism and indeed naturalism is the profound and protracted suffering in the evolutionary process. So just think about, so 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, there were these forest fires in Australia. And they happened for like several months, and they were pretty devastating. And, you could see videos, unfortunately, of like koalas being rescued from the forest fire and other ones that were not able to be rescued. But anyway, I mean, the number of just koalas, for instance, that were burned alive is in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. And that's just koalas. I mean, think about all the other animals that there are in Australia and in those forests, etc. And if you think about that, that's just for a couple months in one part of the world, just for 1 year. But now think of not just a couple of months, but think about a couple of years, maybe a couple of decades, a couple of centuries. Now think about a couple 100 million years. It's insane. I mean, think about this sort of suffering is like definitional of the world around us. And these are non-human animals that I'm talking about, that I'm focusing on, right? It's not as though they're growing in their virtue, or that, they're exercising their free will and intellectual capacities and they're growing as a result of this. No, they're just animals, and they're just there suffering. They're either ripping each other to shreds through predation, or maybe they're starving because that's nature red in tooth and claw, and so on. So this is happening around the world for hundreds of millions of years in the evolutionary process. Like I said, animals are ripping each other to shreds. Animals are starving. Languishing seems to be the norm. And given that, there's been protracted, profound languishing, starvation, suffering, and not only that, but this is the very means by which, if God exists, the very means by which God brought about biological diversity and brought about humans. Like, this is the very means, the very mechanism, the very engine of creation is suffering and death and blood and suffering. Like it's just insane by my lights. And so the argument is that the fact that there is this process of hundreds of millions of years, which is the very engine of creation, as it were, this suffering and death, that fact is extremely surprising on theism. That is not what we would expect if there's a perfect, benevolent, all-powerful, all-knowing God behind the natural world that's creating things, that's bringing about biological diversity. That is not at all what we would expect. By contrast, it's nowhere near as surprising if fundamental reality just doesn't ultimately give a damn about the flourishing and languishing of sentient creatures. It's nature red in tooth and claw. There's no governance from without by a benevolent being. There's no creator that's superintending this process. So it's much, 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 much more surprising on theism than it is on naturalism. And so it provides pretty strong evidence for naturalism. So that's one reason that pulls me towards naturalism, or we could say atheism. What's one reason that pulls me towards theism? Well, I guess I could cover briefly two. One of them is just that, we look around us and we see various contingent things. By contingent things, I mean things that can fail to exist. They exist, but they don't have to exist. It's not the case that they must exist. Rather, they exist, but they could have failed to exist. So this water bottle here, for instance, it clearly exists, but it could have failed to exist. It didn't have to be in reality. There's some way that reality could be such that this thing is absent. Maybe someone never made it. So we look around and we see lots of contingent things. But plausibly, contingent things have some kind of outside explanation for why they exist, right? If you came across in a forest a pile of pebbles, for instance, you wouldn't think that those pile of pebbles either snapped into existence uncaused, they popped into existence uncaused, nor would you think that they could somehow inexplicably exist from eternity past. You would think that there has to be some kind of outside explanation for why these contingent things exist. After all, the pebbles could have been otherwise, they could have been arranged differently, they could have been absent from reality altogether. So that inspires the question, why then are they in reality? So when I think about it, it's supported quite inductively that contingent things have explanations, and even groups of contingent things have explanations outside of them. And it just seems plausible, at least intuitively, that precisely because it's contingent, it could have failed to exist. And that kind of inspires a curiosity as to why it does, in fact, exist. When it really easily could have been otherwise, it could have failed to exist. So why does it exist? So when you think about that, and then you think about the collection of all the contingent things that there are, given that principle that contingent things, including individuals and groups, have an explanation outside of themselves, once you include that principle and you focus on the group of all contingent things that there are, that's going to have, per that principle, an outside explanation. And that can't be, of course, in terms of a contingent thing, because that's the very thing that we're seeking to explain. And so it has to be in terms of something that's necessary, that accounts for or explains why there are the contingent things that there are. And so we have a kind of necessary foundation of reality that explains contingent things. And that, of course, sounds suspiciously like God, you might think. Now, of course, there are various atheist-friendly, naturalist-friendly proposals about what the naturalistic necessary foundation of reality might be. So, of course, you get into the debate there. But that's at least one reason that can incline someone toward theism. I guess one quick second reason is just that, hey, it seems to be a really, really good thing that there are conscious, free, rational, moral creatures. That seems to be a really good thing. I mean, after all, that subserves and furthers various great goods that can come about, like relationships, right? People can engage in relationships with one another. They can reason with one another. They can, if God exists, they could be in a relationship with the Creator, and so on, because they're conscious, free, rational beings. So there seems to be something profoundly valuable about that. And because it's so good, because it's so valuable, under theism, we would at least expect, we'd have some weight of a reason to expect that God would want to bring about these sorts of things, because God being perfect, he's attuned to value, and he would want to promote good things, right? After all, this is what's undergirding the problem of evil. If God's perfect, he'd want to eliminate bad things. So if you think that the problem of evil is successful or provides evidence against theism, you should also think that God would likewise want to promote good things. And so the fact that we do see some profoundly valuable things is actually quite expected under theism, especially if it's profoundly as good as conscious, free, rational beings. By contrast, you might think that that's somewhat surprising under naturalism or under atheism, right? If there's no bias at the foundation of reality towards producing things of value, if there's no kind of intrinsic tendency on the part of fundamental reality to bring about value, well then, why would we get a universe, or why would we get beings that are conscious, free, etc., when there are so many other ways that conceivably reality might have been? It just seems surprising a priori. It seems epistemically surprising that we would be able to get such beings if the foundation is indifferent to it.
So
and,
it's something,
you can talk about, yeah.
So
it's
something like design argument. What
similar,
you're trying.
Yeah, it's similar to that. It's similar,
okay.
But it's focusing on specifically conscious, free, moral creatures. Because, you might be able to have, let's say, like a really designed universe or something. I mean, that might be not super duper 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 surprising under naturalism, but like, think about all the steps that have to be in place for you to be able to get, under naturalism, conscious, free, rational beings. You have to have, firstly, an orderly reality governed by certain orderly laws to allow it to take on a sufficiently rich history and complexity that can undergird such beings. So you can't just have like a chaotic reality. But also, you have to have conditions that are conducive to life, firstly, but not only life. You have to have an evolutionary process, and that evolutionary process has to go on for a long enough time. So, and all the right kind of contingent happenstance accidents, the natural selection pressures and so on, have to be shaped up in very particular ways for you to eventually be able to get rationality and consciousness and so on, because you need super duper complicated nervous systems. You need some kind of brain like that. And if that's the case, well then under naturalism there are going to be lots of different barriers, probabilistic barriers that have to be met and that are increasingly unlikely, just given, let's say, chance. And so it's a kind of, and again, no one is saying that naturalism can't account for that, or that there aren't naturalistic explanations available for it. It's just that on the core hypothesis of atheism or naturalism, that the natural world is all that there is, this is not something that we would expect a priori. This is not something that we would expect to unfold, given all the panoply of different ways that natural reality might conceivably have unfolded. So that's it's a kind of Bayesian argument. It's saying that it's much more surprising on naturalism than it is on theism that you would get conscious, free, rational, moral beings. I guess those are two reasons for theism, and then one really powerful reason for atheism, based on just this hugely protracted suffering process. So anyway, I hope that was manageable.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I would say that naturalism essentially builds itself on like variabilities and on the on a lot and on lots and lots of assumptions that really are too hard to believe. I very much like the design argument, for example, that I mentioned, because it's so hard to create reality as it is, as we can see it. And of course, it's so hard to create such biological beings as koalas and, I don't know, even crabs. Not even talking about humans. And so it seems for me as very unlikely that there is no being that could potentially involve in the process of evolution and of the creation of the universe. And commenting on the argument against theism, I would say that our definition of benevolence is it's very hard to define as humans, as us, to define benevolence for such creature as God. Of course, we are. Well, if we talk about like the usual theistic conception, mainstream conception, we are like. Our consciousness is 1.00001% alike with God, and we can't. I just think that it comes down to the fact that we just cannot understand certain things about God and about his like potential intentions, if there are even intentions at all.
Yeah. No, that's good. It's good because I mean, that highlights that this is something that's often overlooked in debates about God's existence, is that your model of God, the way that you conceive of God, is going to highly influence which arguments you think are plausible, both for and against God's existence. Because if you have a model of God on which, let's say, God is not good in the sense that we conceive of good, that's going to generate different predictions about what we would expect. And certain evidences against God's existence might not actually be, or God's existence defined one way or conceived one way, might not be evidences, or might not be as strong evidences against God conceived a different way. So you bring up a good point, that this is like the plausibility of some of these arguments and how much weight they give to their respective conclusions will depend on the particular model of God that you are working with. So you're right that if you have a different conception of benevolence or some other sort of properties, etc., then that's definitely going to affect your probability calculation. So that's a good point.
Yeah, and I also just thought about this thing that did you ever notice how archaeologists or paleontologists talk about the extinction of the dinosaurs? I don't know, they aren't crying. It's more like they're fascinated with what circumstances were put on them, and how the nature works, and in their perception, the nature works not as filled with deaths and suffering, but as like a cycle of life where one creature leads to another creature and multiple of creatures and so on. I just find that very interesting in terms of God God-inducing suffering.
Yeah.
And how we can perceive it.
Yeah, it is very interesting. There is a sense in which, it's like a cycle of life, but the cycle of life could have conceivably gone so many different ways that didn't involve this sort of profound languishing and suffering, right? I mean, even the cycle of life that we do see, you have to basically you have to overproduce in order to have a chance. Not necessarily humans right now, because we're not entirely beyond natural selection, but we've largely transcended certain aspects of natural selection thanks to modern medicine, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, like if you look at animals like bunnies and things like that, you have to overproduce because so many of your offspring are going to die and so many of them are going to starve, that if you even want to have a chance of some of them passing on your genes, you have to produce this whole panoply of them, and then most of them are going to die off, unfortunately, so that only a select few can go on and basically replace the original organism and their genes, etc. So it's like, in some sense, yeah, you can see the cycle of life, but it's like underneath that there's just so much suffering and inefficiency and death and really badness. So yeah, it's difficult, and there's reasonable disagreement on these sorts of questions and these arguments. The problem of evil. There are so many different aspects of this that are complicated. So
yes, of course, and I don't know. It's just that our world, yes, it is fascinating, and it's highly for me. I think that it's highly unlikely that it was just a set of circumstances, but I wouldn't say that it's flawless, and I don't think that Christianity thinks that necessarily our world is flawless. But I think you can correct me on that, because, my knowledge gets to some point. It's not complete.
Yeah. So it's interesting, Christianity's conception of that. So at least a lot of mainstream Christians think that God originally created things flawless. He originally created them perfect. Creation was in this state of harmony between people, between people and one another, between people and God, between people and nature, and between the different forces of nature. This is what a lot of mainstream Christians think. Originally there was harmony. Originally there was flawlessness in some sense. Then, of course, someone screwed it up, namely the first two humans screwed it up. And what that brought in was a kind of disunity, disharmony, and there was a kind of fall. There was a fall of not only humans, a fall from grace, and a kind of subsequent corruption of themselves, but also corruption of their own relationship to themselves, their relationship to one another, their relationship with God, and their relationship with the natural world. So the fall really had these ramifying effects, such that it kind of broke the natural order. So they would say, some of these mainstream Christians that I'm speaking of, they would say that, yeah, the world as we see it today is certainly by no means flawless in any sense. It's deeply broken, it's deeply flawed, it's deeply disunified, deeply discordant. But a lot of that is due to our making rather than God's. God originally intended it to be a kind of flawless, harmonious reality. And of course, the plausibility of that, we could set that aside for present purposes.
Yeah, for me, it's like the problem with the orthodox conception of Christianity is the Old Testament, essentially.
Oh yeah,
because I don't know, it's so not what you see as a plausible thing to happen, and all of the things, and God's actions in the Old Testament are very questionable. But
To say the least, yes. I mean, like, what is it like? The Canaanites, was it? Was it to not only slaughter the men, but like the men, the women, the children, and also the livestock or something? It's like, dude, this is so overboard. Like, there is no way that you. Anyway, yes, I definitely I can see that. Like, if you take like a thoroughgoing inerrantist approach to the Bible, such that everything that it says is like inherently true or whatever, then you're going to be faced with a very difficult challenge with respect to these kind of Old Testament atrocities. I mean, you have stoning as a punishment for like really basic things. Like you have people being given virgin daughters as a reward for things. You have genocide being commanded by a perfect being. It's like that doesn't to me that's just conceptually confused. A perfect being couldn't command genocide. That's like almost conceptually incoherent to my lights. But anyway, so at least we have sympathies there. We see eye to eye there.
Yeah, and like in Islam, for example, that's a almost normal thing. Yeah, but that is so separated from the perception of God and His will in Christianity that it's very questionable, and I don't know, just I don't know, unpleasant in general. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we can pass to the next question. So, what's your position on various religious ontologies, such as spirits and angels? How can they, exist potentially, and how can people interact with them? So, okay, that will be the next question. But just how can possibly religious ontologies interact with our world?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess we can at least my views on the matter. So at least currently, I mean, I'm skeptical that there are such things as spirits, angels, ghosts, goblins, things like that. I mean, I'm skeptical. One of the reasons is just that I think it's such hypotheses have such like high specificity and high arbitrariness, such that and they make really immodest claims about the world. They're building in these various properties of these things and intentions of these things that, by my lights, they have such a low intrinsic probability that you'd have to get really good predictive payoff from postulating them. You'd have to get really good explanatory power by postulating these sorts of things if you want to countenance them within your ontology. By my lights, they don't have that kind of predictive power. Like basically everything that used to be associated or ascribed to spirits and angels and demons and so on, we now have naturalistic explanations for. We now know about psychiatric illnesses. We now know about sleep paralysis. We now know about we know all these sorts of things. So not only does postulating such things seem to run contrary to a lot of our background knowledge, but it also seems to involve lots of suspicious correlations. So it's like demons are suspiciously they're suspiciously active just when we have a perfectly fine naturalistic explanation of psychiatric illness or something like that. It's like, seriously, that's your hypothesis? Anyway, it just becomes increasingly ad hoc, increasingly unlikely by my lights, increasingly discordant with our background knowledge, and increasingly lowering the predictive payoff, the explanatory payoff of postulating such things. So by my lights, I'm quite skeptical of the existence of such things. But, as you point out, lots of different religions postulate them. So then we are faced with this question, how could they interact with, as you were putting it, how can they interact with the world around us? Well, that's a very good question. It goes back to the problem that afflicted Descartes with the interaction problem, right? So Descartes famously, of course, had his mind-to-body dualism, where the mind is a substance in its own right, or the soul, or a thinking thing, it's a substance in its own right, and the body is a substance in its own right. And then the question arises, how does this unextended immaterial substance interact with this extended material substance? I mean, at least when we look around us, things interact by banging into each other or something like that, or maybe exerting some force from a distance or something like that. But that just couldn't even in principle be the case if something is unextended and it doesn't have these sorts of physical properties like force and energy and attraction and spatial boundaries. So there is this question of, how does it interact? And I mean, I think the most promising solution is the most promising response on behalf of the religious person is just to point out that, like, you're gonna have to reach some kind of primitive bedrock with respect to causal relations. So, like, I mean, think about even if one thing is like banging into another thing. It's like, do we really understand that? I mean, sure, we can see the one thing coming continually spatially closer to the other thing, and then this other thing then continually spatially gets far apart. But like, what is going on there? Is there, like, if you zoom in, are you going to be able to analyze this in more fundamental terms ad infinitum? No, you're going to eventually just have to hit some kind of primitive bedrock. Like, okay, they transfer energy and that's that. And then you're like, well, what's energy? Well, it's like a quantity, it's conserved, and then so you kind of characterize it in abstract terms. So like eventually you just hit some kind of primitive bedrock. Like, okay, it's a transfer of energy. But like once you hit that primitive bedrock, you're opening up the door to just saying like there are certain causal interactions between things which are just kind of primitive. You don't have a more fundamental account or explanation of how that interaction can take place. And so I think they're going to say, like, even in the case of physical causation, you ultimately reach a kind of primitive bedrock, a kind of primitive relation of production between things, one thing producing another or transferring energy to another, which isn't analyzed in further, simpler, more illuminating terms. And they're going to say, okay, well, given that that's inevitable for the case of even physical to physical causation, it's not so problematic that we postulate a primitive causal relation between immaterial unextended things and material extended things. That's probably the best way that they can approach this.
Okay, yeah. And like substantial dualism, well, I would say that it's a very improbable, very not so great argumented position. It's much easier to imagine angels as just an imaginary thing that people having some form of religious experience think of existing. Yeah, I think that's a rather, like conventional position if we talk about most communities of people in Europe, mainly. I just I'm not. I don't know a lot about different cultures with different like perceptions on that. Okay, and the next question is a little like binded with it. We stated that experience in spirits and angels is highly unlikely, but can people experience God in some way, whether perceptively or evidentially?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, there's a kind of trivial way to respond, which the trivial way to respond is like, well, if God doesn't exist, then there's no way that you could experience God in the sense of like experience as in actually latching onto him in some form perceptually or something like that. So I mean that's one way. And so if you're an agnostic on God's existence, then you would consequently be agnostic on whether or not someone can experience God in that sense. But there's a more interesting way to answer your question, which is like, can people experience God in the sense of being appeared to as of God's existence, like being appeared to in a way that they interpret it as God's existence, or maybe even there's some sort of experiential aspect where they claim to experience an omnipotent, omniscient being, maybe unity with it, maybe they experience its love, maybe they experience its presence. Setting aside whether or not it's a veridical experience, we can ask, can people veridically or non-veridically experience God? And for me, I mean, I want to say yes. I mean, we, at least in general, we treat people's testimony at face value, and there's significant testimony across different cultures and times and spaces and geographical locations and so on, that there are these various things that we can call religious experiences. People sense presences. People have mystical experiences where they seem to experience a kind of union with some transcendent reality and maybe the dissolution of their own self, and they people at least claim to have experiences as of something relevantly like God. And so I wouldn't want to say that they are lying about their experiences. They certainly are experiencing something. Then the question is, are those experiences veridical? And if so, or if not, how do we know one way or the other? I mean, it's a good question. One way that you can try to test this is to look if there's see if there's convergence. So generally, if we have different testimonies to something, but they all radically diverge from one another, we tend not to trust any particular testimony among the radically divergent ones. So if someone came up to you and they're like, yeah, I went to this concert and there was a stage, and 10 different people who came up to you and they talked about this stage. One of them said that there was a donkey on the stage. One of them said that there was nothing on the stage at all. Another one said that there was this big fish tank. Another one said that there was a band of 10 people. A still further one said that there were 4 dancing elephants that were pink, etc. So given that there's this massive divergence and disagreement among the testifiers about what they experienced at this concert, it seems like if you weren't there, at the very least you should suspend judgment on what was on the stage or something like that. You should suspend judgment on that. And similarly, some people argue, given that there's this radical divergence about people's experiences of God, some people claim to experience a personal being, others an impersonal being. Some people claim to experience the Christian God, others the Jewish God, others the Muslim God, others the Hindu God, etc., etc., etc. Given that there's so much divergence, so much disagreement, so much just incompatibility between their various experiences, it seems as though, just in the case of the testimonial divergence and disagreement, it seems as though you should also suspend judgment about which of these is veridical, if any. That's one argument that some people make in response to these sorts of arguments from religious experience, and that's one way that, again, we can try to test to see whether or not they are latching onto something. So yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. And well, I think it comes down to ontological and epistemological basis, but we've already talked about ontological one. So if we talk about our basic methods to get knowledge, to get religious knowledge, do you support fideistic or evidentialist view on justification of religious beliefs in general, and including those ones that we've discussed already?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So when it comes to justification and how you come to have knowledge, I tend to take almost a pluralist view. So I tend to think that there are various great-making epistemic features that, when present, can undergird knowledge. So it's not necessarily taking an evidentialist approach or taking an internalist view as opposed to an externalist view. Instead, it recognizes that there are a panoply of different ways that someone can come to have knowledge of some fact. So there might be some ways in which someone can know something where they don't even have to have any reasons of which they're aware. They just have to have some sort of reliable process by which they're latching onto it. So that's a kind of externalist reliabilism. I would say that's plausibly one way that someone can come to know something. But another way is to indeed have such internal reasons of which you are aware, some kind of justification, some considerations that support the relevant things. That would be a more evidentialist approach. So I tend to think that there are a bunch of different ways that someone can come to have knowledge, whether in an externalist sense or an internalist sense or an internalist way. So, I don't think that fideism would count as a way, because that just seems to be, at least as I understand it, fideism seems to just it's irrespective of whether or not you are whether or not you have any justification whatsoever, whether or not you're reliably latching onto something. It's just you just kind of take it on faith, take it on trust, and you don't really have any reasons for it. So to me, that seems to be implausible. But in these other ways, I'm like a pluralist. I allow that someone could have knowledge that God exists if they have certain reliably functioning cognitive faculties, and those are appropriately latching on to the fact that God exists. I would say that then that person probably knows that God exists. Similarly, if someone comes to have a really good argument and they work through the premises and it concludes to God's existence or God's non-existence, and if we suppose that one of those is actually true and they come to that true conclusion through through this reasoned process, then I would say they know probably that God doesn't exist, or that God does exist, whichever way, because again, they have these internal reasons of which they're aware. So, I mean, for me, I guess it's a broadly pluralist approach, but I guess I'd rule out something like fideism. I'd want to say that the epistemic great-making features are the ones that both internalists and externalists in epistemology tend to talk about, which is like reliabilism and these sorts of things. So.
Okay, but I don't know, fideism just seems more like practical, because when we have two theories, for example, theism and atheism, that are, well, like equal in terms of the arguments that support them, and in their value, essentially, and just our views highly influence our everyday life, our ethical beliefs, for example, and just I don't know, like people say that God gives them support, and that's why it's more practical to believe in God and set aside atheism, even though it seems more probable for them that atheism is like more argumentative. No, that's not the word, but is more supported by arguments. Yeah. So, is it like? What do you think about it? Is like practical? I don't know how to say it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're asking if, like,
is this like approach scientific at all? Can we call it relevant in our philosophical discussions?
Oh, that is a very good question, and I mean, this is getting to getting the interplay between practical reasons, or what we could say prudential reasons, and epistemic reasons. So I guess when I was answering your question earlier, I guess I was sort of focusing on what's, I guess, epistemically proper. And for me, yeah, the practical considerations would, I think, be irrelevant to what's epistemically proper, because that's a function of either whether or not your cognitive faculties are functioning reliably and they're reliably latching onto the truth, or whether or not you have certain reasons of which you're aware that favor the thing in question. But I guess there's the separate question of what is rational, all things considered, for you to do, like considering the epistemic desiderata, the epistemic considerations, in addition to the practical ones. And so could it be overall rational, including both practical and epistemic rationality? Could it be overall rational to, let's say, either believe in God or commit to God or these other sorts of things, because those practical considerations are so significant, so strong, perhaps? And it's an interesting question. I guess I'm not quite sure. I'd really have to think about that further. I mean, I guess here's what I'd lean towards saying is that if it's so overwhelmingly unlikely, then it doesn't really matter if it's super practical. I mean, like if I know, for instance, or I have really, really, really good reason to think that, let's say I just broke my leg or something like that. It might be more practical, or it might be like better for me psychologically speaking to believe that I didn't break my leg or something like that. You know, the world would be a better place if I believed that. Or so, like, you know, I'd be happier. But like, come on, like I should still not believe that, because the truth of the matter, or at least what I have really good reason to believe, is that I actually broke my leg. So, I would say that in that case, because it's so likely that, evidentially speaking, epistemically speaking, because you have really good reason, it doesn't matter what the practical consequences are. The good reasons weigh out, and so you should act and believe in accordance with the epistemic reasons. But things get trickier when the case isn't so straightforward, like the case for the thing in question. If the evidence is much more ambiguous, like maybe it's 50-50, or maybe you just don't know, and the evidence is roughly counterbalanced between the two positions, and the practical considerations very strongly support one of them, maybe it is, all things considered, rational to go with the one that practical considerations support. So anyway, I think I'd have to think about that further. So yeah, I guess that's my answer.
it just comes to like epistemic values and maybe ethical values, because we can like take an utilitarian approach and say that practical views support our existence and make and maxima. It goes in accordance to utilitarian maxima, and that's why we should believe in practical things rather than rather than truthful ones. And then we can come down to that and say that truth is more practical than than lie, and that's why we have two conditions: truthfulness and practical relevance. Yeah, but that's a little tricky. And I think that it's a little absurd, but essentially we can do that thing in the air. Okay. So the next part, next questions are just about theoretical basis of philosophy of religion. Well, not the basis, just some questions that can be very I don't know, just not intuitively understandable. So, what's the difference between panentheism and theism if most of theist concepts suggest that God can interfere in almost every part of our world? So, how far does it get for God to interfere in a world, essentially?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So there are sort of two aspects to this question. So one of them is about God's interference. I guess I'll take that second, and then the first one was about like the distinction between panentheism versus theism.
Yeah,
so that's really interesting. One of my friends, his name is R.T. Mullins. We've co-authored some stuff together. He has this article published in a philosophy of religion journal entitled "The Difficulty of Demarcating Panentheism," and what he argues is that it's extremely difficult to define panentheism. So what we can say is that panentheism is a brand, a version of theism. So, you've just got theism, which is like the bare claim that God exists. Like we could say the traditional God of monotheism. It's like all good, all knowing, all powerful, and it's the creator. So that's basically theism. And then panentheism would be a particular version of that. So I guess there are two main claims that I would associate with panentheism. Firstly, the denial of creation ex nihilo. So God doesn't create ex nihilo. Instead, he creates ex deus, or out of himself. Like, he creates out of the resources of his own being. You can almost think of creation, or you could think of God as almost like cookie dough, and then creation is almost God like using cookie cutters to like bring out of the dough, and like shaping his being, forming his being in various ways to make creatures and so on. So it's like in that sense, and this brings us to the second point, would be that God is not identical to the universe, but the universe is in some sense in God. So panentheism means everything in God-ism. So like the universe, everything is in God in some sense. It's intrinsic to God. But God is still more than the universe. Maybe God could have refrained from creating, and so God just would have existed alone. But given that there is a universe, God sort of creates it out of the resources of his own being, and it's kind of residing in him. In him we live, move, and have our being, right? So that's kind of... we are in God. We're intrinsic to God. God encompasses everything, but God is still more than the universe. And God would have existed even if he hadn't created the universe. So that's kind of the way that I conceive of panentheism. There's a lot of controversy there about how you characterize it, but I think that's one of the mainstream ways you can characterize it. It's a very interesting doctrine, and it does get around one of the problems with traditional theism, which is creation ex nihilo. I mean, a lot of people think that that's just really intuitively implausible. Like, how could something create ex nihilo? Like, create out of absolutely no materials whatsoever. Like if someone said that they made a cabin in the woods and all they said was, let there be a cabin, and it just like popped into being or something, and they didn't make it out of like brick and mortar or whatever, or all that sort of stuff, we would think that they had gone crazy or something. Like, no, you didn't. You can only make material objects by rearranging or refashioning already existent stuff. So a lot of people find creation ex nihilo really problematic intuitively. And so Panentheism would kind of avoid that. That's interesting. That's a benefit of Panentheism with respect to kind of a more traditional, should we say, maybe classical theism where God creates ex nihilo. Okay, now the second question is God's interference. I mean, again, this is going to kind of depend on your model of God. I mean, under Panentheism, I mean, you could almost take that in a kind of theistic idealist way. Like we are, in some sense, ideas in the mind of God, perhaps, or we are kind of mental images in God's mind. And he just has this scene of creation, which he's actualizing in his own mind. And in that sense, God's interference would simply amount to God's, I guess, conceiving of things differently or imagining things differently, right? So that would be like God's interference. On other models, God might step into the natural course of things and modify them in such a way that they wouldn't have gone that way had God not intervened. Instead, they would have gone their natural course in some other way. So there are lots of different ways that you could conceive of God's interference. And of course, now we're getting almost similar to the interaction problem that we discussed earlier. Because, you can ask, like, okay, well, then how does God do that? Like, how does God move my water bottle here or something like that? And then, yeah, you'd probably just say there's a kind of primitive causal relation. But anyway, yeah.
And if you take like the most conventional approach to theism, is there, well, how can it possibly be that God, who created this very like separate thing, such as a material world, how can he interfere in it if that's like a whole another matter, if we can say that?
Yeah, well, how does he? I mean, I guess you could ask him, not me. That's one thing you could do. I mean,
well, probably.
yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know. I mean, I would, again, if I have my theist hat on, I'm just going to say, like, how does he do it? Well, he just causes it to happen. How does he cause it to happen? I don't know, he just wills it to happen and it happens. I mean, that's the end of the story. I mean, it might sound unsatisfactory, but eventually, I mean, again, you're going to reach some kind of primitive bedrock. If you continually ask why, how, if you ask that with respect to, let's say, me, like pushing this over, I mean, yeah, you could say, okay, well, there are various particles in my hand and they move closer to this and then it pushes it this way. There's a kind of transmission of force. But it's like, how do they transmit a force? Or that how does it transmit energy? And you're eventually like, well, okay, let me show you some equations about mass energy transference between systems. But then you're like, yeah, but like how do those equations work? Like how do they latch onto reality? Like how does that translate into this kind of physical system, like one thing going into another? And it's like you can ask how. Eventually you're just gonna have to say, listen, it just does, okay? At some point, it just works. So you just kind of reach this primitive bedrock, and I think that's what they're going to have to say with respect to God's existence. God just wills something to happen, and he causes it to happen, and there's no mechanism by which he brings it about. It just happens.
Yeah. Well, I probably have to look closer to panentheism because, I think that seems like convincible that
I think it's really interesting.
Yeah. It seems a little more, I don't know, rational, but
yeah, and it's like a little more intimate with God. I mean, I don't know, God's more intimate with creation, and I mean, we don't have to say that it's primitive. I mean, we are intimately familiar with imagining things in our own minds. There's really no question of how we like. I mean, there is, but like we know that this is a feature of reality, that there are minded beings and that they're able to imagine things and conceive of things. So we're not adding any like super duper mystery or inexplicability by saying that at the foundation of reality, there's this mind, and fundamentally this mind is just imagining various things. And that's not to say that the things around us aren't real. It's just to say that ultimately, fundamentally, they are images in the mind of God. It's just this is how the images are. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Okay, thank you. the next question is, what's the difference between pantheism and ontological naturalism? Because I would say that's a pretty not intuitive thing to understand.
Yeah, so I myself don't really have a full understanding of pantheism. I mean, it's difficult. What is pantheism? Well, pantheism just itself means like everything Godism, right? So everything is God in some sense. Now, what's difficult is that, at least under Spinoza, he's kind of this, you might think of as a father of pantheism or whatever. He just has this kind of substance monism. So fundamentally, there's only one substance in reality, and that is God or nature. He famously says it's like a disjunction. He calls it God, but he also calls it nature. And so, yeah, fundamentally, and then this thing has different modes or aspects. And so that's, of course, the reason I think why we see this like multiplicity of properties around us, why we see multiplicity of things. Fundamentally, there's only one substance, but it does have various, indeed, I think it's infinitely many modes. So yeah, I mean, what is pantheism? I mean, I guess God is identical to the universe, something like that. The universe is identical to God. Maybe there are various features of the universe that naturalists wouldn't want to ascribe to it, like personality and goodness and all-powerful and so on, and all-knowledgeable. And you might think that pantheists go on to say that about the universe. So they like agree with the naturalists that, yeah, there is a universe. Yeah, there are physical things around us. Yeah, it has this structure and 13.8 billion years old, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in addition to that, this universe has various other properties, super cool properties, like magical properties, like it knows things, it's all powerful, it's a person, or personal in some sense, it's all good, like all these sorts of things. So that's kind of how I understand pantheism. And I mean, that's how it would differ from naturalism. I mean, it's similar, like it says, yes, you naturalists think that there's this universe and that, you know, there are various physical things within it. Okay, fine, but just notice that this universe is itself God and it's imbued with various properties that are divine properties. So I think that's how they would differ. I mean, this researching pantheism, like I said, I mean, it's difficult. Pantheism is likewise difficult to define, and there are various different versions of pantheism. Like Spinozistic pantheism is going to be different from others' views. So,
yeah. So that's like naturalism with the addition of God's properties.
Yeah, it's like
benevolence and omniscience. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, they might characterize those properties differently than traditional theists do, maybe. But I'd have to research it further. You can sort of think of it like spooky naturalism or like magical naturalism, something like that. You just sprinkle in some pixie dust, and yeah, bada bing, bada boom, you've got God.
Yeah, well, but we can also say that from a like naturalistic point of view, that nature knows everything, but about it. But in the sense that it doesn't have like consciousness necessarily, but the processes are so the processes in it are so complete and so, I don't know, logically structured. So like we can say that it knows everything.
That's very interesting. I mean, that's probably, I mean, that might be one, no, I mean, that might be one kind of argument for pantheism. It's like, well, listen, it's simpler if we say that there's just the universe. You don't have to add God onto the picture. That's a simpler ontology. But also, I mean, look at this universe, right? It's got various orderly, beautiful, intelligible structures, and maybe those are in some sense aspects of God, or like, you know, like these are pointing to some various divine features of the universe itself. So it's simpler than, you might think, it's simpler than traditional classical theism, but also it can account for lots of other things that kind of bare naturalism isn't able to account for, as you pointed out, like kind of harmony, order, intelligibility of the universe, and various beautiful aspects of it, and so on. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I know it. Yeah, so I don't know. In my opinion, there's like practically no particular difference but it's a very interesting notion about like the addition of God's of what we usually consider as God's properties. All right, and the last question is mathematical, but no, just ethical in general. So, please share your opinion about divine command theory and potential God's involvement in ethics. Is it plausible to say that God God defines our ethics and our ethical and our needed beliefs in terms of what is ought and what is not?
That's a very good question. So before I answer this, I can at least just alert the listeners to my video that I recently put out. It's not my latest video, but it's one of my most recent videos, and it's a monolithic 12-hour-long video, and it's examining over basically over 150 plus arguments for God's existence. Now, there are about a dozen or so of those that are moral arguments that try to give God or afford God a role in grounding or explaining morality. And so in that portion of the video, I level various objections that I find plausible against, divine command theory and, in general, theistic meta-ethical views. So just for the audience, I have kind of worked out views in there, and I developed the arguments against it. And to find that portion of the video, you could just look at the comments. I did a pinned comment with all the different timestamps, so you'll be able to see which portion of the video I talk about moral arguments.
Okay, we will add it in the description box.
Okay, sweet, thank you. So with that out of the way, I don't find divine command theory plausible, unfortunately. I don't find theistic ethics plausible more generally. Listen, God either has some reason for commanding what he does or he doesn't. If God has a reason for commanding what he does, then surely it's that reason which is doing the explanatory heavy lifting with respect to the rightness or wrongness of the action in question. If God's reason for commanding us not to torture or rape people is because it causes profound suffering to the victim or something like that, or maybe it violates the victim's rights, well, then you don't need God in this picture. You can just say that the rights of the victim ground the relevant moral properties, or the suffering of the victim grounds the relevant moral properties. So I would say God in that sense is odious. He's an intermediary. You don't need him if God has a reason for commanding what he does. That's that horn of the dilemma. I would say then it's really implausible, because again, it's that more fundamental reason which is doing the explanatory heavy lifting. It's not God. Now suppose God doesn't have a reason for commanding what he does. Then it's by definition arbitrary, because God doesn't have a reason for it. It's literally, there's no reason whatsoever why God is commanding us to torture, not to torture, as opposed to torturing, right? There's no reason whatsoever. So that is not morality. I mean, if anything is... If I understand anything about the domain of moral reasons and the moral landscape, it's that it's not arbitrary in that manner. That torture could have just as easily been morally obligatory as morally impermissible, and so on. So again, God either has some reason, in which case God isn't really playing any fundamental explanatory role in morality. It's that more fundamental reason, or God doesn't have a reason, in which case morality is completely arbitrary. It's by definition arbitrary, because there's no reason underlying God's commands, and so on. So by my lights, that is a plausible objection to, divine command theory. And of course, you can go back and forth on these sorts of things, but at least by my lights and what I've done research so far, I find that a very plausible objection. So that's my main reason. There are other ones as well, but that's the main reason why I don't find theistic meta-ethics compelling.
Yeah, that's true, and I too would suggest that, if God created conscious, rational beings such as people, and gave them freedom, of course, again in the most conventional conception there is, then why is the question of morals is still reserved to him, and not those rational beings he created. But then we can say that if we've come to the real moral realistic conception, and we are the beings that God created, then isn't it still like divine command theory? But with the subject of who defines ethics referring to us.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's understandable.
No, I mean, there is. I mean, it reminds me of a question that's, I guess, looming in my mind and a lot of other philosophers' mind about divine command theory. It's like, is it a moral realist view? I mean, we tend to define moral realism in terms of the truths being independent of our stances, or at least independent of people's stances, like their attitudes and their desires and their belief states and their commands and so on. Like, it doesn't matter if you command me to go and kill someone. Because the moral truths aren't dependent on any of our commands or our stances or our attitudes. It doesn't matter if someone desires to torture someone or someone desires to, kill innocents. They still shouldn't do it. So that's that. I mean, moral realism tends to be defined in terms of being independent of stances. But if that's the case, well, then it seems as though divine command theory might not actually be a moral realist view, because it's making moral truths dependent on someone's stances. It's just God's stances, of course, but it's still someone's stances. It's either their belief states or their commanding states, some sort of stance that they take towards propositions and towards actions and so on. And that doesn't seem to be realism, some philosophers argue. So anyway.
I suppose that it's a realist position. It's just subjectivism. It's just the ideal observer, the theory. The sub branch of it.
It would depend on how you define realism. As you point out, there are different versions of realism. Some of them are just committed to moral truths, and so then subjectivism would be a form of realism. But others define realism, which is unfortunate. You have philosophers defining these things in different ways, which is annoying. But other philosophers define it in terms of you got to have stance-independent truths. So that's one way that some philosophers define it. But you make a good point.
Yeah, it may be objective, but I can. There can be questions about it. I don't think that realism should be objective. It is real what I perceive with my eyes right now, but it's subjected to me. I don't think that it's not true if I see it with my eyes. All right, that was the last question. All right. Which is up for you today or something. Okay. Thank you very, very much for attending and talking for 1 hour and 40 minutes, I suppose. It was very nice having a conversation with you and having a conversation with you on such an interesting topic.
Okay, thank you for having me on.
So this was for Strike Philosophy. Please subscribe and please watch it till the end, if you know English, of course. And we will see you later. Thank you very much.